Cemeteries are great places to visit. Far out. If you get lost trying to find Edward Dickens' grave, there is a sign. It's right inside the front gate. It's really not hard to find. Oh, it's very bright and sunny. This fellow was killed by a lightning strike in 1900. I'm particularly fond of the fact that his gravestone says "Thy will be done," because that is about as "Thy will be done" as you can get. This fellow here, born in Moree in 1863, has possibly the best middle name ever. Actually, his first name's pretty cool too. This is Ernest Anxiety Trainer. Yeah, I can relate to that. Hello and welcome back to Curiosity Mine, and welcome to another cemetery, this time in Moree, New South Wales. Now, you may be familiar with Charles Dickens, the author of such classics as A Tale of Two Cities.
It was the best of times, it was the blurst of times.
And Oliver Twist, and A Christmas Carol, and Great Expectations.
We are expecting great things of you.
Bleak House, Nicholas Nickleby, and a multitude of others. But what you might not be familiar with is the youngest of his 10 children, Edward, who was shipped off to Australia for being a disappointment and is buried here in the town cemetery at Moree, New South Wales. So Charles Dickens had a number of children, all of whom were given some fairly ridiculous nicknames, including Charles, who was known as Flaster Floby, Mamie, who was known as Mild Gloucester, Kate was known as Lucifer Box, Francis was known as Chickenstalker, Henry was known as Mr. Harry, Walter was known as Young Skull, Sydney was known as Ocean Spectre because apparently he had eyes like a whale, Alfred was Samson Brass, and relevant to today's story, Edward, also known as Plorn, or Plornish, or Plornishmaroontigoonter, or Plornishmaroontigoonter. I'm seriously not making this up. The Dickens family was large, and Charles made no bones about sometimes losing track of his entourage of children. One quote from Charles is, "I begin to count the children incorrectly. They are so many, and to find fresh ones coming down to dinner in perfect procession when I thought there were no more." There are a number of reasons that British people found themselves in Australia in the 1800s, from convict transportation, which continued until 1868, to the desire to make a mark on the world for people like explorers and scientists and seafarers who really wanted mountains and lakes to be named after them. And then there's assisted immigration, which encouraged skilled workers and those in search of a new life to head to the new continent and start afresh. But there's a really weird and very specific category of immigrants to Australia in those early years that we need to talk a little bit about, and that category is children of wealthy families who proved to be disappointments. And there's more of them than you'd probably expect. One such disappointment was Edward Bulwer Lytton Dickens, the youngest son of Charles Dickens, described by his father as amiable, shy, affectionate, but a boy of no real ability, and as it turned out, no real application or energy. On the whole, I could have dispensed with him. Many accounts describe Edward, or Plorn, as Dickens' favourite son, despite Charles's fairly brutal assessment of the boy in some writings. I would imagine, based on 19th century priorities, that a parent would have judged their kids more strongly based on their success in life than their actual affection for them, as evidenced by the fact that Charles Dickens packed up not one but 2 of his sons and sent them to Australia effectively as a lesson for being unmotivated and unsuccessful back in Britain. Plorn, or Plornishmaroontigoonter, or Plornishmaroontigoonter, moved to Australia in 1868 at the age of 16 to follow his older brother Alfred d'Orsay Tennyson Dickens, that's Samson Brass if you're following along at home, who was kicked out, who migrated 3 years earlier. Both found their way quite immediately to remote western New South Wales, with Alfred coming to manage Corona Station near Whitecliffs and Edward becoming manager of Mamba Station near Wilcannia. You'll be pleased to hear that no one in Australia referred to Edward as Plornishmaroontigoonter. Here he went by the more acceptable nickname of Ted. He married a local woman by the name of Constance de Sailly. He ran a few businesses, chiefly a stock and station agent. He evidently failed at most of his business ventures. He didn't do well on his station runs due to poor weather, probably poor management, poor luck, or who knows why. He had a perpetual debt to his older brother Henry Dickens, that's Sir Harry, of £800 that he never paid back. And then he went into politics, because that's always the last bastion of the unsuccessful businessman. He was an alderman for Berkshire Council, he was inspector of runs for the Burke district before running for Parliament as member for Wentworth, which he did not win, and then as member for Wilcannia, which he did win, and he kept for 5 years. His political career was honestly not very inspiring. He signed a couple of pretty no-nonsense bills about getting water and irrigation opportunities to a couple of remote communities in New South Wales. He was on a couple of committees for the extension of some mineral ore tramways, and honestly, not a great deal else. Edward Bulwer Lytton Dickens passed away a sick man in a Moree hotel at the age of only 50 years. He was buried in an unmarked grave that remained that way until many decades later, when it was finally marked by a distant cousin and a historical researcher who placed this obelisk here to honour Edward Dickens' final resting place. I love a good obelisk. Got a couple of little friends over here. Curiosity Mine is now on Patreon. Patreon is a service that allows you to directly support your favourite creators to allow them to continue making the content that you love. If you enjoy these videos and you think Curiosity Mine deserves your support, head on over to patreon.com/curiositymine for more information on how you can support the channel directly. If you do, you'll get your name on this list of amazing people who are supporting the channel already. So head to patreon.com/curiositymine or curiositymine.com/Patreon. All roads lead to Rome, but for now, let's get back to the cemetery. When I start putting these videos together and doing all the research, one of the biggest questions I always have is, what is this video about? What's the point? What do I want the viewer to take away when the video is over? And what I thought this video was about is not what this video is about at all. As I was writing this, I thought, holy crap, Charles Dickens was a horrible dad. He sent 2 of his kiddos to Australia because they didn't live up to his benchmarks. That's clearly the point of the video, obviously. And I kind of biased myself as I was writing this by getting hung up on that. But it's not really the story. It's not the moral. It's not the point. I think the point is that we've come a long way since the 1860s. Charles Dickens didn't send 2 of his sons to Australia because they didn't live up to his expectations. He sent them to Australia because they didn't live up to society's expectations. That's how it worked in the 19th century. This is only just after the Industrial Revolution. And society dictated that if your kids didn't tick all the boxes to show that they would be appropriate and productive members of the population, society insisted instead that if you were wealthy enough to do so, you should just ship them off to the great southern continent because that's the right thing to do. That'll pull them into line. They'll have no choice but to learn and adapt and grow up. It's easy to get hung up on the fact that Edward Dickens was 16 years old when he was sent to Australia, but we mustn't forget that the concept of the teenager, the young person, wasn't invented until after World War II, in the 1950s, when wealth and stability allowed Western society to effectively add a few more years onto childhood for young people to be free and stupid, or whatever teenagers do these days. In the 1860s, you were either a boy or you wore long pants, and there was nothing in between. So in Edward Dickens's time, there was no such thing as a teenager, and no expectation that anyone would take it easy on a 16-year-old for being lazy or uneducated or unmotivated or confused about life. Charles Dickens made it clear in his letters that he loved Plorn. He was his favourite son, and it clearly hurt the old man to have to send him away. But Dickens was a man of honour and a man of respect, and he did what society told him was the right thing to do. Charles wrote to Edward, "I need not tell you that I love you dearly and am very, very sorry in my heart to part with you, but this life is half made up of partings, and these pains must be borne." Do I want to open a can of worms about how what is considered right and wrong has changed over the centuries? Absolutely not. But in this case, I'm confident that Edward was an unfortunate victim of how things were and not the decision of a bad father. And I'm glad that I've learnt that from what I've put together here. Alfred Dickens, Charles Dickens' other son, who was also sent to Australia in the mid-1800s, was manager of a few rural properties in New South Wales and Victoria. He went briefly into business with his brother Edward as a stock and station agent before beginning a career as a travelling lecturer, giving talks about his father's life and works. He died at the age of 66 in New York and is buried in a cemetery in Manhattan, which I doubt. I will be visiting anytime soon unless my subscriber and view numbers really start to go up into the sky. If you find yourself in Moree, please consider stopping by the Moree Cemetery to pay your respects to the youngest son of Charles Dickens. Cemeteries are great places to visit. It's like a free museum. I do recommend. Also, Thomas Keneally, the author of Schindler's Ark, wrote a book called The Dickens Boy, which I would have in my hand right now if I wasn't so forgetful and left it in the car. That's the one. It's a largely fictional account of Edward Dickens' life in Australia. I do recommend, but be prepared to do a little fact-checking along the way if you want to get the story straight. This video was made with the help of Lisa, and because I happen to be in Moree today. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to Curiosity Mine on YouTube and maybe even supporting the channel directly via Patreon. The link is in the description. And thank you for watching.